Great, good. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is to talk about the interconnections between mountains, climate, and sediment systems. And the reason for this is that all of these three elements are connected to each other, and they are mediated by global climate and environmental processes that operate on a global scale, but yet are felt or are manifested through the workings of sediment systems and geomorphic processes at a regional or a local scale. So here we have the interconnection between these elements operating through the workings of the Earth system. And it's therefore the workings of the Earth system through both physical, biological, and chemical processes and physical processes in the landscape that give rise to the distinctive types of landforms and the evidence for environmental change that we can deduce from mountain environments globally and locally. Where are we going? There we go. Okay, so the context of what I'm going to talk about today, and this provides the, if you like, the intellectual framework for discussing some of these things that I'm going to do this afternoon, is the fact that, as we know, we have evidence for global deglaciarization in the Anthropocene. So this term deglaciarization is different to the term deglaciation. So deglaciation is, of course, the process of a decrease in glacier mass as we transition from a glacial to an interglacial. The term deglaciarization, which is a proper term, it isn't just made up, it is a proper term in the literature. And what this refers to is the ways in which present-day glaciers in mountain ranges globally are decreasing in mass and indeed are completely disappearing during the present-day interglacial as a consequence of global climate and environmental change in the Anthropocene. So we have lots of evidence from many locations worldwide for deglaciarization as a direct consequence of global warming. So this provides not only an opportunity for mountain scientists to have a better understanding of things such as the sensitivity of glaciers to climate and environmental change, but of course it then provides the context for understanding what happens when those glaciers melt. And this then leads us into understanding sediment systems. So associated with global deglaciarization, we also have a rebalancing of mountain weathering and erosion processes that are mediated by climate. So of course, if climate is changing, then these weathering and erosion processes are also changing. And these have implications for the generation of landforms and the workings of mountain sediment systems. So therefore, going alongside global climate and environmental change, we have changes in mountain geomorphology and sediment systems. And increasingly, we are getting a better understanding of how we have this relationship between climate forcing in the Anthropocene and the response of mountain systems generally, and geomorphic and sedimentary systems in particular. So if we have deglaciarization, we then have the intriguing proposition for a change in dominant process regimes affecting mountains globally, when we have the transition from glacial and periglacial regimes to a paraglacial process regime. And this is starting to be identified in mountain environments globally. And I'll mention this shortly. So as a consequence, in the context of that background, we can put forward a number of important questions that are essentially research questions for understanding the workings of mountain systems. So what are the driving factors behind changes in mountain systems and environments? And this includes not just climate and environmental change, but also, of course, aspects of human activity in mountain environments as well. So urbanization, agriculture, tourism, as well as the natural spread of ecosystems and changes to the biological environment as a result of climate change. So then how and in what ways are mountains changing? So this includes both the physical and the abiotic components of mountainous environments. What are the spatial and temporal patterns of these changes? And this is a key element because it refers to the sensitivity of certain mountain systems to be affected by climate forcing. So any forcing response relationships has a spatial and temporal expression. And of course, it's very likely that there is a lot of variability in the nature of these responses to climate forcing. So therefore, are all mountains changing in the same ways and at the same speeds? And we know already the answer is no. And finally, what are the implications of these changes for things such as geohazards, ecosystem services, and for mountain communities? So of course, people and the other aspects of the biological environment occupy mountain environments, and these are extremely important. So of course, just a couple of weeks ago, we had this big kind of essentially lake outburst event taking place in Kashmir. And this impacted on many communities and caused many fatalities. So this is one of the impacts of climate change in mountains that affect people and communities. So what I'm going to do today is not provide answers to these questions, but these questions provide a framework for future. So what I'm going to do this afternoon is, so first of all, I'm going to talk about the relationships between mountains and climate and sediment systems. And then I'm going to look in detail at the nature of mountain sediment systems and their landforms. So we're going to take a geomorphic approach first. And then finally, I'm going to talk about this transition from a glacial dominated environment to a paraglacial dominated environment that is triggered when we have this global deglaciarization. And finally, I'm going to frame this discussion in the context of mountain sediment systems. So we'll start off with the first element here, looking at the relationship between mountains, climate, and sediment systems. So to start this analysis, I'll just show this graph, which is hopefully something we know about, which refers to the trajectory of mass balance changes, monitoring services, reference glaciers. So these are, if you like, a sample subset of glaciers globally, which are the histogram, which corresponds to mass balance changes of glaciers on a global scale. What, of course, we can see here is that under present-day global warming over the past decades, we've had a dominant negative mass balance relationship. Glaciers are melting away. And this overall global pattern is shown very clearly in this zoomed-in regional scale pattern that we can see here from the World Glacier Monitoring Service. So this shows that every region of the world is experiencing glacier melting away, in particular in mountainous environments. So it isn't just glaciers that are changing in mountainous environments. The PERMOS project in Switzerland also provides the context for changes in periglacial conditions and environments in mountains as well. So here we have a critical combination of not just glaciers, but also periglacial processes that are changing here. What this image also shows, and this is on the bottom part of this particular panel, is the fact that in association with changing or increasing permafrost temperatures, we have a thickening of the active layer and increased and renewed activation of other mountain landforms such as rock glaciers. So here we have a critical interconnection between climate forcing and mountain geomorphic response. So we can consider some of those relationships in this simple kind of flow diagram here, which illustrates the co-relationships between climate forcing and how this impacts upon the physical weathering and erosion processes that take place within mountain systems that are mediated by land surface weathering and by the development and the processes associated with glaciers in the landscape. So here, weathering and erosion give rise to sediment availability in mountainous environments, which then give rise to the thing at the bottom, which is increased sediment yield. So here, of course, we have a key relationship between all of these three things here. Now, this, of course, is a fairly well-known relationship, but what it highlights is the fact that if we have a change in climate forcing, such as the onset of global warming in the Anthropocene, then we can anticipate mountain systems are going to change, and therefore eventually we are going to get a change in sediment yield and sediment system dynamics within mountains as well. So we can start to anticipate what sediment systems are going to do in mountainous environments. So the way in which we can consider these relationships is the fact that in mountains, we have the processes of weathering and erosion, which contribute to sediment generation. So weathering of rocks and loosening up of bedrock fragments generates loose materials that can be then moved, and this is the second bullet point, moved downslope by a range of processes. This includes gravity-driven slope processes, larger scale mass movements, such as rockfalls, landslides, and so on, as well as glaciogenic transport driven, of course, by glaciers themselves. So here we have, if you like, a sediment cascade from generation of sediment through to moving of sediment, and then following the movement of sediment, we have the formation of landforms, most commonly in foot slope locations or within mountain valleys. But landforms are generated as a result of differential sediment movement. So, of course, if we have a larger amount of sediment coming in compared to the amount of sediment that is leaving the system, then the sediment thickness is going to increase. So this aggradation means that a landform, in other words, a distinctive type of geomorphic body, can generate or form as a result of this net sediment deposition. So here, climate generates sediment, sediment moves down slope, and sediment creates landforms. And of course, as geomorphologists, it is the landforms that provide us with the most readily available information, because we can identify landforms, we can map landforms, we can look at where they are, we can look at the sediments that they contain. And this tells us something about the processes that gave rise to formation of those landforms. So here, basic geomorphic mapping in mountainous environments derived from the landforms that are present in those environments can tell us something about the workings of mountain sediment systems. So what we can see here is a simple representation, a block diagram that illustrates the characteristic suite of landforms that we might anticipate finding in mountainous environments. So these are standard landforms, and I'm not going to talk about them here. What we can see, however, is that these landforms arise most commonly as a result of glacial, paraglacial, and slope processes in combination. In addition, however, what we can also see is that across mountain landscapes, we have differential processes of weathering and erosion. So what this often gives rise to is in some mountain locations, in particular in highest elevation areas, where there is lowest amount of surface sediment, we often have preserved relict surfaces or landforms that are associated with low rates of weathering and sediment yield. So here we can use, for example, cosmogenic dating methods to inform on how quickly exposed rock surfaces in mountains weather away to produce sediment, which then disappears downslope. By contrast, in many lower elevation areas of mountainous environments, we can have the formation of, if you like, active landforms. So landforms that are actively moving or actively aggrading or building up over time as a consequence of higher sediment yield moving downslope. So I'm going to show you throughout this presentation a number of photos, in particular of different mountains that I've looked at worldwide. This is one that is located very close to me, and this is in the high Drakensberg range of Lesotho. So this represents the highest elevation areas of mountains in southern Africa, and this is a typical summit surface that we find in the non-glaciated mountains of southern Africa. So here the elevation is 3,450 meters. So some of the highest points in southern Africa. So this landscape, this mountain landscape, has not been affected by glaciation, but what it has been affected by is weathering by mainly physical and also chemical weathering processes over very long time periods, hundreds of thousands of years. So what that gives rise to are these very distinctive rock weathered surfaces, this is on basalt, that reflect weathering over these long time periods. And also as a consequence of weathering, we have a slope sediment yield. We also find many typical landforms that we also find in other mountainous environments elsewhere in the world, such as these block fields. And these are generated mainly by weathering processes, chemical weathering in particular, and to a lesser extent, physical weathering processes of frost shattering. So here we have, if you like, kind of equifinality. We have a block field generated by mainly chemical weathering rather than the sort of Felsenmeer kind of block fields that we are familiar with in Europe that are generated mainly by frost shattering processes. So these sort of typical alpine landscapes of non-glaciated environments contrast, of course, with the typical alpine glaciation environments that we find in many mountain blocks worldwide, including, of course, the European Alps and elsewhere, such as here in the Himalayas. So here we have the dominance of steep incised bedrock ridges that are generated or formed by lots of glacial incision. So over steepened slopes, high sediment yield, and lots of sort of loose mass movements associated with this high sediment availability. So now what I'm going to do is to outline the nature of mountain sediment systems and their associated landforms. So make a link here, therefore, between aspects of weathering and erosion and the kind of landforms that we might anticipate finding in many mountain environments worldwide, in particular those associated with glacial processes. So, of course, we start off our discussion with this really nice photo here of something that we don't see very much of, and this is the ice bed interface. And as you can see here, this is from Franz Josef in New Zealand. So, of course, what we can see here is the bottom of the glacier. We can see the scoured bedrock at the bottom, and in between we have the subglacially abraded material that reflects both glacial abrasion and is, of course, then available for deposition in the form of glacial landforms. And that's, of course, what we can see here within this glacier fall field. We have a sort of a bouldery fall field here, and at the margins of the glacier, we have the deposition of these diamicton units, as you can see, that correspond to previous patterns of sediment deposition that reflect the workings of this glacier system as an abrading agent, an agent of sediment generation. We of course see very similar kind of patterns elsewhere in the world. This is another place that I've looked at in the North Cascades in the USA, a beautiful snowbank here. And we can see very clearly in this four-field environment, although I guess can't see too clearly here perhaps, but on the right-hand side, you can see some Little Ice Age moraines that correspond to a former cooler period when, of course, this snowbank was much bigger, forming a protalus rampart. We see similar things closer to home in the Carpathians. So this is part of the Sedibud project, and some of you may be part of this project. So here we have people standing on the outer moraine of this decreasing niche glacier in the Carpathians, with a very steep bedrock cliff behind and huge amounts of sediment within this bedrock basin. So here we have vast accumulations of sediment that do not correspond to the size of the present day glacier. When glaciers retreat, of course, they give rise to steep-sided moraines made up of a range of diamicton materials, as we can see here. So in recently deglaciated environments, we have steep, loose materials that are readily available for subsequent secondary reworking by slope processes. And this, of course, is one of the mechanisms by which we can have sediment moving downslope by slope processes, forming secondary landforms and being therefore part of a mountain sediment system. Glaciation, of course, gives rise to not just a large amount of loose sediment, but also very steep, hard bedrock slopes. And it is down these bedrock slopes where we can have then the formation of weathered material that is affected not by glacial, but by periglacial processes. So here we have the bottom of a very extensive blocky scree slope that corresponds to periglacial rather than glacial processes in action. So both of these process domains in combination give rise to high amounts of sediment that form distinctive landforms. And it's those landforms that are key to understanding the sediment systems of mountain environments. So one key way that many researchers in mountain environments have tried to fix the sediment systems is by conceptually organizing their understanding in a source to sink context. Source sink focus is the relationship between source areas of sediment that are derived by weathering and erosion, mainly from the uppermost part of mountain systems, and then the way in which that loose sediment then moves downslope by gravity-driven processes, by glacial and periglacial processes, and then that sediment accumulates at slope foot locations or within mountain valleys, forming distinctive types of landforms and sediment stratigraphies. So the idea behind the source to sink mountain system is that stuff starts at the top and then accumulates at the bottom. Separating these source and sink zones, we then have a transport zone in the middle. So this idea of source to sink mountain systems assumes that material starts off at the top and then accumulates at the bottom where it stops. So this type of sediment system is most commonly linked to things such as incised debris torrent channels, which provide a conduit which transports material from top to bottom. It's associated with the formation of debris or colluvial or alluvial fans at the bottom of the slope, and it may be associated with foot slope fluvial reworking. So this type of source to sink system is demonstrated through this photo here, which was the front cover of my book on Paraglacial Environments, which is what, 10, 12 years old now, but which I'm sure you've seen, where here we have a sediment source from a weathering in the rocks behind. We have a scree slope that corresponds to the movement of that weathered material down into the valley bottom. We then have a river in the bottom of this valley, which then transports this material to the sink, which is the sea. So the blue bits that you can see there is the North Atlantic. So we have deposition in a aquatic environment that represents the sink of this sediment. So this idea of a source to sink system is a powerful model, but it assumes a number of things. It first of all assumes that we have a sort of a seamless transition from one part of that system to another with no blockages, with no disturbances or barriers in that system, which mean that that sediment gets captured instead of making its way to the sink. It therefore assumes that there is connectivity between the different areas of sediment sources, sediment transport zones, and sediment sinks at the bottom. What we know, however, is that this model simply doesn't work. So several studies have examined this model in detail. And here is the output of one of these models, and you may know this paper. So this is a field-based study from the Austrian Alps, from the Tyrol region. And what this study focuses on is basically looking at the sediment dynamics down one mountain hill slope. Now, what we can see here is that this study is able to zone identify three different zones. Shown in red, we have the source areas, and these are located towards the top of the slope. At the bottom, shown in blue, we have the sink areas, and separating these two zones, we have, if you like, the transport zone, shown in yellow. So this seems to support this model, but if you actually look at these patterns, they are highly spatially variable. So we don't get nice, if you like, altitudinal zones that correspond to particular places in mountain environments where we have sediment being generated, where we have sediment being transported, and where we have sediment being deposited. It is highly variable. So therefore, there are some potential problems associated with this source to sink model. So first of all, in many instances, sources, transfer zones, and sinks cannot be easily identified. So in part, this focuses on the way in which we as researchers make observations and interpret our observations. So many, of course, periglacial processes related to the active layer or related to creep processes take place very slowly. So this means if you're looking at a slope, you can't see anything moving. So therefore, we may misinterpret field observations simply due to the spatial scale or the time scale of our observations. Secondly, not all sediment accumulates in sinks. Not all sediment makes its way down to the bottom of the slope. So when you go to a mountainous environment, you actually see lots of sediment sitting on that slope. It's not at the bottom, it's halfway up. So is this an interpretation of, if you like, an incomplete system? Or is it an interpretation of a system that doesn't work in the first place? So in all of these interpretations, there are problems with quantifying sediment fluxes in mountainous environments because they take place often very slowly. So we therefore have to consider the variable spatial and temporal scales of operation of slope driven processes in mountain environments. So our resolution isn't sufficient to identify whether these source to sink models do actually work or not. In addition, and this is the final point, landforms, in inverted commas, do not always develop. So sediment stratigraphies may also vary when we look at stratigraphies in foot slope locations. So if we're trying to identify a diagnostic landform that corresponds to sediment accumulation, often we can't see it because all we see is a smooth slope, no landform. So if there's nothing to see, then there's nothing to identify. So we have an absence of evidence. So this makes it problematic to try and identify and interpret source to sink models. So mountain sediment systems in reality are actually quite different. They do not correspond to source to sink models. So what we often find on mountain slopes is a general thickening of surface sediment as we go from the top to the bottom. So this is our characteristic sediment wedge. And then on the surface of this wedge, we may have a range of superficial landforms, including things such as terracets, solifluction sheets and lobes, earth lobes, debris lobes, solifluction lobes, block streams, and debris flows that are hanging on the mid-slope. So we can call these, if you like, arrested flows. So they don't flow all the way down to the bottom, they stop halfway up. So here we have evidence for, if you like, incomplete sediment transfer from the top to the bottom. So in many mountainous environments worldwide, we actually see really good evidence for these incomplete flows. So all mountainous environments, including this here, we can see these kind of stone or earthbank lobes that are typical of solifluction processes taking place on the mid-slope of mountain slopes. So here the sediment simply hasn't got to the bottom. Maybe it will never get to the bottom of the slope. So here we don't have efficient sediment transport down the slope. The sediment stays in the middle part of the slope. What we can also see, however, is, and again we find this worldwide, where we see things such as this here, where we have a turf-banked lobe, but here we can see the outside of the lobe is higher elevation than the middle of the lobe, which is lower elevation. This tells us something about differential sediment transport rate and therefore sediment transport yield. So here, the outsides of this lobe are vegetated and that holds the blocks together, whereas the inside of the lobe is not vegetated, it contains more moisture, it's more mobile, it's moving more quickly, so therefore we have net sediment export in a downslope location. So here we actually see evidence for differential sediment mobility on the scale of just a couple of meters, as you can see here. So therefore, mountain sediment systems and their associated landforms are very complex. So now what I'm going to do is to discuss this further in the context of global deglaciarization and the transition from glacial to periglacial and paraglacial process regimes. I'm then going to consider that in terms of its implications for mountain sediment systems and sediment budgets. So we will revisit this idea of a sediment system. So I'm sure you've all come across this idea of paraglacial environments, but here is a brief reminder. So paraglacial environments and processes refers to those non-glacial processes that are directly influenced by glaciation, or an alternative definition by Colin Ballantyne, glacially conditioned sediment release. So the important thing here is that it relates to sediment availability and sediment mobility after glaciers have melted away. So therefore, we have a relationship between deglaciarization and higher sediment mobility in a paraglacial process environment. So, of course, once glaciers form distinctive landforms, such as this huge great moraine here, this moraine, like any accumulation of glacial sediment, is made up of material of different sizes. There may be high meltwater availability, which makes this material loose and slurry-like, so it can move very easily. We have steep-sided landforms, and these landforms are not held together by vegetation. So therefore, at the onset of glacier retreat, we have lots of loose material in the surrounding environment that is potentially available for enhanced slope movement. So we have higher paraglacial sediment yield. So Ballantyne therefore proposed this characteristic paraglacial relaxation model that describes the relationship between time since deglaciation, which is on the horizontal axis, and associated sediment yield, which is on the vertical axis. So broadly speaking, as we can see here, when glaciers start to melt away, we have high sediment yield. That sediment yield then decreases exponentially over time until it reaches a rate of sediment yield that is equivalent to the background geological rate for that particular region. So this period of paraglacial relaxation varies in length. It can take between a few hundred years to 10 or 1,000 years or so. So in many parts of the world, the paraglacial process regime is still continuing, even following late Pleistocene deglaciation. So here, the paraglacial process regime of enhanced sediment availability and sediment yield can exist for a very long period of time, even after all the glaciers have gone. However, this viewpoint of exponential sediment decay over time is complicated if, due to high magnitude events, such as a big landslide or other mass movements, or by sea level change, we can have newer supplies of glaciogenic sediment made available for subsequent reworking. So superimposed on top of this paraglacial sediment yield, we then have individual spikes. And this corresponds to short-term events or activities that give rise to pulses of enhanced sediment availability. So here, this model of sediment dynamics is interrupted by short timescale events that have a local scale focus. So I just want to highlight this particular model here. As you can see, it's a paper that's submitted at the moment, and heaven only knows what's going to happen with this paper. But what we have here is an example from the east coast of Ireland, which corresponds to paraglacial sediment relaxation in a coastal environment. So panel A in the top left-hand corner shows a glacial moraine that intersects the coastline. So when the glacier first melts away, this moraine is left upstanding, like so, during a period of low isostatic sea level. Then in panel B, we have post-glacial sea level rise. So the sea level is coming up and eroding into that glacial material. So here we have paraglacial slope sediment reworking, as well as reworking of glacial sediments by coastal processes. So as sea level rises, that sediment gets reworked on shore to create things such as sandy beaches, beach barriers, and coastal sand dunes. So here we have sediment reworking from two different places. And then finally in panel C, and this is based on brand new dating evidence, we have evidence for reactivation of this paraglacial sediment availability as a consequence of enhanced storminess during the medieval warm period and Little Ice Age. So we know the European Little Ice Age between about 1500 and 1800 AD was a period of enhanced storms. So this enhanced storminess gave rise to an increased pulse of sediment reworking by bigger waves, which then created brand new landforms. So here we have the generation of storm beaches that have been now dated by radiocarbon dating of marine shells that are contained in these storm beaches, indicating when these storm beaches were reactivated. So what we can see here is, if you like, field evidence for reactivation during successive time periods of different amounts of paraglacial sediments. So Colin Ballantyne proposed a sediment reworking model for paraglacial processes. So we go from sediment sources at the top of this slide down to sediment sinks at the bottom of this slide. So what he considered is that we have successive phases of sediment reworking over time. What I just want to highlight here is the role of one particular mountain landform, namely rock glaciers, and its role in disrupting this sediment cascade model. So rock glaciers are important features of mountainous environments, and they can be broadly formed by three separate sets of processes. They can be formed as a result of glacial processes, by shearing at the ice margin and generating ice-cored moraines, and by marginal down-wasting. So here we have supraglacial sediment that accumulates on top of a stagnant ice margin to create, if you like, glacial formed rock glaciers. We can then have rock glaciers formed dominantly by paraglacial and periglacial processes associated with the generation of permafrost and the movement of permafrost, and sediment being added to the permafrost layer by rockfalls and by protalus creep. And then these processes can be amplified under cool climates, where we have advection processes taking place within the body of the debris itself, where we have supercooling of air, and this causes the creation of intraformational ice lenses, which allow the rock glacier to move slowly downslope under gravity. So here we have a number of controls on the generation of rock glaciers. So all of these three types are found in different topographic settings. They are associated with different sizes and mixtures of debris and interstitial ice. And therefore, each of these three different types of rock glaciers exhibit different sensitivities to be affected by deglacial warming in the context of deglaciarization. So melting of present-day glaciers under present-day global warming. So what this then gives rise to are different types of rock glaciers that are controlled by dominant environmental processes. So glacial type rock glaciers are dominantly controlled by water availability that is controlled by temperature, by climate. Periglacial type rock glaciers are controlled by development of permafrost and the active layer, which is temperature controlled. And then we have paraglacial type rock glaciers that are controlled by sediment availability and which are therefore amplified when we have high sediment yield driven by glacier melt and the transition from a glacial to a paraglacial process regime. So here we have some examples of rock glaciers worldwide. So the first one here is what you can see at the front of the slide here in the high Andes of Chile. This is an arid and cold environment. So this is a glacier type rock glacier where we have a downwasting of the glacier front with a layer of debris sitting on top of the glacier. and you can see some outcrops of the glacier at the front there as well. This example here is a steep and wet glacial environment. So we have high precipitation, and this is a paraglacial type rock glacier. So we have very steep active weathering, generating high amounts of sediment, which builds up on top of the glacier surface. Here is another example from that similar kind of region. This is where we have a stagnant glacier front and a glacier tongue, and we have a moraine type glacier being rock glacier being generated in the foreground, as you can see there. And this is a good example of a periglacial type rock glacier. And what you can see here in the high-vis jackets are some of my students. So when I worked in the UK, this is where I took students on a lovely field trip in North Wales. And you can see a huge relict rock glacier right at the front here, which is generated by rockfall and generated as a protalus rampart. So this is a periglacial type rock glacier. So these rock glaciers are actually extremely important because they act as obstructions to geomorphic change and sediment loss. So here, the presence of a rock glacier prevents sediment from moving down slope. It captures that sediment. So it has a similar buffering effect as a cascading river sediment system. So the presence of these rock glaciers acts to prevent sediment moving down slope, even if we have deglaciation. So it prevents that sediment from getting into river valleys. So therefore, we have a very distinctive paraglacial sediment system. So here on the on the left-hand side, we have source, transfer, and sink. So the source here is sediment generated in mountainous environments by glacial and periglacial processes. And the eventual sink is a sediment accumulation at the base level, which is the adjacent coastline. So this paraglacial sediment system envisages that within mountain valleys, we have sediment being captured within mountain valleys. So due to the presence of rock glaciers and due to the presence of steep and narrow mountain valleys, these valleys capture mountain sediment. So the valleys get filled up with mountain sediment, which means that rivers are not able to excavate this valley sediment, and therefore we have lower sediment yield going into adjacent rivers, and then lower sediment yield going into adjacent coasts. So this is a sediment starvation model. So here we have good evidence in many environments, many mountainous environments worldwide, for capture of mountain sediments within mountain valleys. So here is an example here. We've got steep mountain sides and we've got infilled valley in the foreground. So you can see the sort of a river incision into some of this valley infill that's not able to excavate this valley infill. So here we have, if you like, kind of a point bar, if you like, deposits that are infilling this mountain valley that are not able to be excavated by the outflowing river. So that commonly gives rise to incised and paired terrace systems, where here we have a limited amount of sediment reworking. We can also see this similar effect in non-glaciated environments. So this is again in the Drakensberg of Lesotho, and what you can see on either side of the slide are bedrock dominated summits, and then we have inclined bedrock slopes, and these slopes are covered with sediment. And then if you look right in the center of the slide, we have a very narrow river valley. So here the river is incising only a very, very narrow part of this valley, because a lot of the sediment on either side is simply relics. It is not being reworked. It's just sitting there. So here, what this means is that instead of having an interconnected source to sink model, what we actually see is that sediment doesn't make it to a sink. It's captured within those mountain valleys and is not available for lowland river sedimentation. So if we have sediment starvation in lowland rivers, we then potentially have sediment starvation to adjacent coastlines. So paraglacial coastlines globally are likely to experience sediment starvation and therefore enhanced coastal erosion, especially under rising sea levels in the Anthropocene. So what we see along many glaciated coastlines are these sort of wonderful pictures here of drumlins, drowned drumlins. So as you probably know, I've done a huge amount of work on drumlins. So these drumlins and erosion of drumlins provides sediment for the adjacent paraglacial coastal landforms, such as the beaches and spits that you can see here. So without higher amounts of sediment coming in through the adjacent rivers, eventually this coastal sediment source, which is a finite source, there's nothing being added to it, this is going to go. So what we're going to be left with are extensive boulder beaches with steep diamicton cliffs, and all of the fine material has disappeared. So this is a net erosional coastline that's being strongly affected by the fact that it's a paraglacial relict. So it's a representation of a previous glacial processes, and there is no sediment supply being added to this environment. All we have is a limited amount of sediment reworking within this environment. There's nothing new coming into this environment from the incoming rivers. So some key discussion points here is that mountain sediment systems don't always conform to this idea of source to sink. Source to sink is a very convenient way of considering sediment systems because it enables us to consider things like sediment volume and sediment budget, but it doesn't exist. It's a fallacy. So source to sink systems are convenient, but they are not realistic. What we've seen, however, is that global deglaciarization can lead to a shift in process regime globally from glacial and periglacial to paraglacial. So the ways in which we consider the workings of mountain sediment and landform geomorphic systems needs to change, because over the next decades, we're going to have a shift in these process domains. So if we only look at some mountain glaciers, they are disappearing, and we're not going to have anything to do. So we need to think of mountain sediment systems in a paraglacial context and not just in a glacial or periglacial context. However, as I have described here, a theoretical framework for paraglacial sediment systems exists because I've done it. Help understand the ways in which paraglacial process systems and processes associated with deglaciarization can lead to things such as mountain geohazards under climate change. Not just outburst floods and bluffs and Jurkulaups and things that we had seen recently in Kashmir, but also other types of mountain geohazards as well. So enhanced mass movements, enhanced flood effects with implications for biodiversity, for human activity, for tourism, for socioeconomic activities, for transport. So there are a wide range of different impacts that mountain sediment systems actually have right here, right now, upon real people globally. So this isn't just a hypothetical academic argument. It's something that has real implications for the ways in which we examine and monitor climate and environmental changes in mountain environments worldwide. So some important future research directions, which I'm going to finish with here, are how are mountain systems going to respond to future climate change? So when we consider this, we should not just think about mountain glaciers and paraglacial environments and their roles as mountain water towers, but also we need to think about people, about things such as ecosystems, maintenance of biodiversity, carbon storage. All of these things are extremely important in mountainous environments, as well as, of course, their role in radiative forcing in amplifying the effects of global warming. So all of these things have implications for mountain environmental change for a wide range of different things, including aspects of sustainability, which is how we as mountain scientists can make a link to things that are real and relevant. And therefore, this highlights the important role of scientific knowledge and of monitoring of ongoing change in mountain systems to not only derive an understanding of what is changing, how it is changing, and why it is changing, but also an understanding of the sensitivity of mountain systems to climate and environmental change. Because, as I mentioned at the start, not all mountain systems work equally, and not all systems within those mountains work equally. So understanding the sensitivity of mountain systems is an important future research direction. And these are important ways in which we as mountain scientists can apply our research to address real-world issues that affect people and environmental management in mountainous environments worldwide. Okay, thank you very much. That concludes this presentation.